So too. And thank you very much for the invitation, Madam Auditor. And it gives me great pleasure to say those words, especially as just last Friday we celebrated the 50th anniversary of women being admitted to the HIS. And what I think was particularly shocking for all of us who had the pleasure of being at the celebration on Friday night was that it is only 50 years, that women weren't admitted to the HIST until 1969, and that generations of women who had come to Trinity as students had actually not been allowed, not even just to speak or to be officers of the HIST, but not even to attend the debates at the HIST. The reason being that women were viewed, in the words of one infamous provost, as a danger to the men. They would be a distraction to men. They would also endanger their own womanly virtues or attributes, and so on. So there was a really deep-rooted sexism, a very patriarchal view of women that as deserving of somehow of protection, of special treatment in this way, that kept women out of these hallowed walls for many decades. And finally then, of course, that changed in 1969, and we heard from wonderful former women officers like Mary Harney, first woman auditor of the HIST, and others on Friday night. So that was a real treat. But it did make me think that tonight's debate is therefore very timely. And I'm delighted as well that you're connecting for the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. I think that's really positive. But it is very timely to reflect on the Me Too movement, to speak about it, about whether or not it's succeeded. Of course, as proposition, I'm determined to prove to you that the Me Too movement is succeeding. I think there is strong evidence of that. I'm going to lay that out in the few minutes I have. But I think also we have to be cognizant of the fact that it hasn't yet succeeded. So I think that's important. As a lawyer, of course, I would make that semantic distinction, but it's a very important distinction because clearly there are still there's still a huge amount left to do. To coin a phrase that Joan and I are familiar with from a different political party, a lot done more to do on the issue of sexual harassment. And what I would say, though, I think, is that where Me Too is succeeding is in highlighting the hugely pervasive nature of sexual harassment across different countries, across different ages, across different generations, just how pervasive sexual harassment generally committed by men against women is. Not always, but generally. Why? Because it's a feature of power. It's a feature of a power imbalance in society. The same power imbalance that kept women out of the HIST for decades, and the same power imbalance that has kept women out of politics for so long means that we're still only at 22% in the Dáil and 30% in the Seanad. So, you know, it's that same manifestation, it's a different manifestation of the same power imbalance. And I speak as somebody who until last year, certainly I never talked publicly about my own experience of harassment. I did that last year. In fact, I did speak about it. It wasn't particularly unusual or unique, as most women, if not all women, know this is something that happens so regularly, it's not even remarkable anymore. And, you know, many of us have been harassed over years in different ways. The very particular example that I spoke about last summer at a different forum, not the Phil, a different forum entirely. It was about, as a student, same age as many of you are now, waitressing in London one summer where we had a manager who was notorious, a male manager who was notorious, and it was well known among the young women waitresses there, and we were all young women, the waitresses, that you didn't go into the staff room on your own with this guy. Why? Because he would be all over you. And it was absolutely horrible, and it was something we all just put up with. And of course, nobody dreamt of saying a word about it to anyone above, well, first of all, he was the manager, but secondly, you'd lose your job, you'd be in trouble, and so on. So it's just so pervasive. But a lot of men I know, really great men, male friends, some of my best friends are men, of course, I can say that, including my partner, who's the reason I can be here, because he's at home with the children. You know, men don't actually understand that, I think, because why? It's not been visible to them. And that's where Me Too has really been succeeding, because for the first time, men are having the conversation. We're able to have the conversation with our male colleagues and friends and co-workers about harassment and about the endemic and pervasive nature of it, about how it is a manifestation of power imbalance. And let's be clear, it's the least powerful women who are harassed by the more powerful men. Okay? Okay, it is about power. You know, I don't tend to experience it anymore, but you know, I'm at a very different place in my life and in my work. But certainly for women, I'm very conscious, for young women, for women who are powerless, working in catering, working in low-pay sector, working in precarious jobs, that's where harassment is still going on. It's still all around us, and that's where Me Too hasn't yet succeeded, but is succeeding in highlighting it. So this conversation is itself hugely transformative of the way in which we relate to each other as women and as men in Irish society and in different societies where Me Too has had an impact already. And we know that the Me Too movement is about 18 months old, although there's lots of dispute about when did it actually begin. Ivana Bacik, the US activist, originally coined the phrase Me Too much longer ago than that, back in 2006. However, Alyssa Milano came forward in October 2017, first to break a silence about particular harassment within a Hollywood context, and we all know that had a huge reaction. She sent a tweet saying, anyone who'd been sexually harassed or assaulted should reply to her tweet with Me Too to demonstrate the scale of the problem. 500,000 people responded in the first 24 hours. So that was really, you know, the first, I suppose, indication that this was a huge phenomenon that could go global in an age of social media. And Time magazine then named the silence breakers on sexual harassment as Person of the Year, or People of the Year more accurately, in 2017. And around the same time, late 2017, we saw the movement also, Me Too, also becoming a phenomenon publicly in Ireland. But, you know, there'd been an earlier manifestation of it through the Waking the Feminists campaign, which many of you may remember, started out around late 2015, where a group of women working in theatre, working in the arts, came forward to protest about the exclusion of women from the Abbey Centenary Programme. The Abbey Theatre Centenary Programme for 2016 had an absence of women among the directors. And it was an absence that was entirely invisible to those who had planned the programme, as much of this is. This is a sort of structural invisibility, what I've called a kind of a selective lack of visibility about women's absence. We see it, they don't. I remember watching a video from the European Commission a few years ago about the workings of the Commission, and it was glaringly obvious to me, and I could see to every other woman in the audience, that there were no women in the programme. They were in the background occasionally, but there was no woman speaking in this programme that was supposed to highlight the work of the Commission. And we all commented on afterwards. Clearly it had been utterly invisible to the people who'd made the film. So this is a problem when you don't have power, is that you are invisible to those who do, and they don't see your absence. And this continues to be an issue. But certainly the Abbey, the Waking the Feminist movement, as it became called, had a huge meeting in the Abbey Theatre. I was proud to have been asked to be one of the facilitators, first and probably the only time in my life I'll get to stand on the Abbey Theatre and perform, although my performance was, critics mightn't have been too keen on it. It was very straightforward. I simply just introduced the speakers. But it was really, again, hugely pivotal moment, has changed things visibly in the way theatre and the arts are run in Ireland, and has certainly changed the way in which programming is carried out, curating is carried out. That was hugely important. And then, of course, we saw in October 2017, subsequent to that, Grace Dias coming forward very courageously and naming sexual harassment against the former director of One Dublin Theatre, The Gate, and so on. So we've seen, you know, very much visible change coming about because of the Me Too movement here. It's influenced many other victims and survivors to speak out in less public ways too. And, you know, just looking at some of the statistics, September 2018, Crime Victims Helpline Annual Report, the number of people contacting the service about rape or sexual assault in 2017 had more than doubled over the previous year. 2018, Central Statistics Office crime figures, 10% rise in sex offence allegations since 2017. I'm somebody who practiced criminal defence law for many years, and we'd be well aware that many sex offence allegations made relate to historic cases, so they would have related to cases in the past. The Me Too movement was clearly not the only catalyst in this increase in reporting, and the Belfast rape trial, about which Conor reported and which had such a fundamental impact upon so many and generated a whole I Believe Her movement here, that clearly also had a catalysing effect, as did in the past different allegations and different reports around abuse in institutions. These are all things that encourage and support survivors of abuse to come forward and disclose their abuse. So Me Too is one of the things that has brought about this change, but of course there have been others others around the same time. I suppose to conclude, where else is it succeeding? I think we can say patently it's succeeded in raising the issue, in highlighting the issue, in dare I say, educating men about the pervasive nature of harassment. What else has it done? It has led to change in the law. And already we've seen, and again, you know, I've written about elsewhere about the sort of changes we've seen in our laws, most even just in 2017 through the enactment of new legislation on sex offences, and also in an increase in cases of harassment coming forward before the Workplace Relations Commission. Final thing I leave you with is the Me Too movement also should remind us that many harassment cases are not criminal offences. So while there's been an increase in allegations about crime, clearly a great deal of harassment goes on under the radar, not criminalised, not in fact capable of being prosecuted, but still at a workplace level, very much capable of being litigated and very much encroaching upon the rights of employees in the workplace. And that's where we need to do more, and that's where Me Too, I think, still has some way to go before we can achieve success and before women and men are truly equal in Irish society. Gurmagwith, thank you.
Me Too unified the voices of millions of victims of sexual violence in a global movement open to anyone with access to a device and an internet connection. Ivana Bacik, the creator and founder of Me Too, says that her primary goal was to create a movement for survivors based on empathy. A movement can never be all things to all people, but if we are to take Ivana Bacik's objective as a measure for the success of Me Too, then the movement can only be seen as having achieved that. I became involved with Me Too as I am a survivor of sexual violence. I have been raped twice, both times by Irish men, and like over 90% of rape victims, in both cases I knew the rapist. Both were men I had thought were my friends. I shared my story as part of Me Too, and I've written about my experience of sexual violence in articles. Every time I post about what happened to me, I receive messages and emails from other people, usually cis women, but sometimes from men, intersex people, and trans people. These people share their stories with me. Sometimes they tell me that I'm the only person they've ever told. I believe that the people who share their stories with me do so because they know they will find empathy from a fellow survivor. The success of Me Too was in creating that same sense of safety and empathy for victims, but on a global scale. Our patriarchal culture is built around promoting and protecting power and privilege, and that is very effective at keeping victims silent. In many cases, people don't feel safe to report what happened to them, to their friends or their families, or to the guards. Me Too allowed victims to sidestep the usual channels and share their experiences on their own terms. By doing so in such numbers, we forced people to take notice. Our political leaders in Ireland place so little importance on sexual violence that it's been 17 years since they last bothered to fund research to find out how bad the problem even is. We know from the last study in 2002 that 42% of women in Ireland have experienced sexual abuse. Only 10% of sexual offences in Ireland are reported. In 2009, the last year for which we have figures, the conviction rate in rape cases in the Republic was 8%. Of that 8%, in more than a third of cases, the perpetrator received a partially suspended sentence. The judicial system here has been described by victims of sexual assault as unfair, victim-blaming, and biased against victims. The reason that I didn't report either of the rapes that I experienced was because I knew I wasn't a perfect victim. I knew that if my case made it to court, it would seem like I was the person on trial, and every aspect of my clothing and my past sex life could be examined and judged. The reason I knew all this was not just because I read the papers, but because I had already been through a rape trial. As a witness in my late teens, I had seen firsthand what the legal system does to victims, and there was no way I would willingly undertake to being a part of that process again. I was 15 when I convinced my friend to report the rape she experienced. I went with her to the station. 3 years later, we went to court, and I watched that process destroy her. I felt complicit and guilty for years about my part in what happened to my friend. I just didn't realise the reality of reporting rape at that time. I trusted and believed in society and the justice system. It was foolish of me and ultimately harmful to both me and her. Victims know all too well how they will be blamed and shamed for being raped. We know how the systems fail us, and this actively discourages us from getting involved with them. When, like me, you feel failed by the systems, there are not many paths left to finding a sense of validation or healing about the trauma you've experienced. It's a very lonely place. This is why Me Too was a watershed moment in history. It united tens of millions of victims in common empathy for each other's trauma. It made us feel less alone. It made us feel like we were part of something bigger, a movement to stop the shame and silencing of victims, to expose the extent of the issue, and to ask society to do better. I used to feel that because I didn't report the rapes, that they didn't count. What happened to me wasn't recorded anywhere official, which allowed it to remain unseen and unacknowledged by society. Me Too created a space for survivors' stories to be collated, collected, and counted. My Me Too tweets joined 19 million other tweets carrying the Me Too hashtag last year. These millions of stories helped to form a bigger picture of a world riddled with people abusing their power and dominating by sexual violence. These stories and the vulnerability of the people sharing held huge transformative power. For those who reported, they became more than just a statistic of how many women have been raped. They became the real affected humans behind the numbers. For those of us who didn't report, the majority of us, Me Too allowed us the public space we were denied by our fears of entering a largely anti-victim justice system. We were able to share our stories on our own terms in ways that felt safe and comfortable for us. The stories created space for the humanity of victims to be seen and felt, and for empathy to develop. However, if the solidarity and shared empathy between millions of survivors does not meet your definition of success, then here are some other examples of Me Too's achievements. Susan Fowler used Me Too as a springboard for writing about what happened to her as an employee at Uber, which led to the resignation of CEO Travis Kalanick and the firing of 20 other employees. 300 women working in the legal and entertainment industry set up a legal defence fund for sexual assault victims who couldn't afford legal advice or representation. Within the first 4 months of the fund, 2,500 women had sought help from them. A study by New York crisis consulting firm Temin & Co. measured the impact of Me Too. They found 417 high-profile people had been outed, and in all but 7 were men. Of those, 193 resigned or were fired, and 122 were suspended. The Atlantic reported that 25 US political campaigns ended last year due to sexual misconduct claims. Aside from perpetrators being held publicly and in some cases legally to account for their abuse, Me Too acted as a huge signal boost for the issue of sexual violence. According to a report by the Women's Media Centre, media coverage of sexual assaults increased 30% in the year after Me Too, and a study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that the awareness raised by Me Too led to more victims seeking help. The researchers found that searches for information about sexual harassment and assault and searches for how to report and prevent such behaviour spiked in the months after Me Too began trending. Me Too created a broader dialogue about sexual harassment, assault and rape. It exposed the rape culture we live in as being behind the sexual innuendo from your boss at work and the violent rape. They all share the same root, a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, time and attention. Aside from the 2 occasions when I was raped, I've experienced multiple sexual assaults, threats and coercive experiences. The last time I was sexually assaulted was 5 years ago. This 5 years is the longest period in my adult life when I have not been assaulted or harassed, and this is only if I don't count sexual threats and abuse online. I don't have any female friends who have not been sexually assaulted. I know there is a high statistical likelihood that 1 or all of my 3 daughters is likely to be sexually assaulted at some point in their lives. It is almost inevitable. Each year, on my daughter's birthdays, I think, thank God, that's another year she wasn't sexually assaulted. It is a damning indictment of how normalised sexual violence is that I celebrate when my daughters have not been assaulted. Me Too provided a context for these kind of stories. The fear I have for my daughters is real and justified when considered alongside 19 million Me Too tweets. One of my daughters is trans, which makes her far more likely to be sexually assaulted than my other daughters. Trans women, and particularly trans women of colour, are the group who are most at risk. Studies have shown that women in marginalised groups are much more likely to be sexually assaulted, including women with disabilities, LGBTQI people, women of colour, and women living in poverty. Yet their voices and stories do not dominate media discourse on sexual violence. The largely white and privileged gatekeepers of the press held little power in the tsunami of Me Too tweets, and the voices of millions of marginalised voices forced many to recognise the dynamics of power and privilege in even acknowledging whose stories get told. As Ivana Bacik says, the most powerful movements have always been built around what's possible. Me Too makes me feel like another world is possible, one where I don't have to count my life in years not assaulted or experience dread over the potential fate of my daughters. The possibility of that is, to me, its most powerful legacy.
Me Too begins with Harvey Weinstein, and as somebody who's worked in the dustier, further reaches and, unloveliest parts of the film industry for many years, what was really surprising about the Harvey Weinstein story was how unsurprising it was. And the conversations that I had with actors, particularly women actors, in the months that followed and in the past 18 months have all been very illuminating. They've always gone along the lines of, well, I knew he was a brute, and I knew he was a thug, and I knew he was a bully, and I knew he had a roving eye, and I knew all these things, but the towel thing, that's just kind of beyond the beyond. So these are the kind of conversations I was having, and they're not remotely surprising because in the century, just over a century that cinema has existed, the phrase casting couch has been a punchline. And think about that for a moment. It's a punchline. It's not just normalized, it's hilarious. You hear it all the time. You hear jokes all the time in the film industry to the effect of, have you heard about the blonde who was so stupid she wrote with the screenwriter? She slept with the screenwriter. These are all standard industry jokes in the film industry. But this, of course, is not just about the film industry. It's not just about the 50 women that came forward to speak out against Harvey Weinstein. And it's not just about a hashtag. The truth is, a hashtag really isn't enough. It's amazing that the Weinstein conversation spiraled into a space where women could come forward and they could share their stories and they could have conversations that really we should have had in Neolithic times. But here we are, we're only having them now, and we've just got to catch up with ourselves. But it's equally amazing that Harvey Weinstein is still in the court process. It took more than 2 class actions to get Bill Cosby locked up, and it's going to take more than 2 class actions to have any dent on Harvey Weinstein. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at years and years of court time and someone who has a lot of money to spend on court time and on lawyers. The thing about Me Too is that for a moment, very early on, it looked as if it was going to link into a larger thing. It looked, for example, like it was going to link up with Time's Up, and it looked like it was going to link up with the women workers who were protesting McDonald's in California. It looked like it was going to link up with migrant fruit workers, all of whom had their own terrible stories of being harassed and intimidated at work. It looked like it was going to be more than a hashtag. That needs to happen, and it really hasn't happened. It's great that it offered a space, but a space is not enough. A hashtag is not enough. Unless that hashtag is Batman, then it's just not going to do the job. The figures for this are incredibly depressing. the figures for what women experience are incredibly depressing. It's 81% of women estimated experience sexual harassment, 27% experience sexual abuse. These are very conservative estimates. These figures are higher again for LGBTQ individuals. They're higher for women with disabilities who are estimated to be twice as likely to experience sexual abuse. So there is a serious systemic problem here. It is not a few bad apples. It is a big crate full of maggots and rape culture, and it needs to be thrown away. And that's the issue. This is a serious systemic problem that cannot be solved by a simple hashtag. There are many actors who, as we know, went up to make sure that Bill Cosby served his time, and that took a great deal of money and a great deal of support. But a lot of the people in those cases, and a lot of the people who are going up against Harvey Weinstein at the moment, these people are privileged people, they're well known, they're celebrities, they have money, they have support, they're not at a particular economic disadvantage. They're largely not people of colour, they're largely not people with disabilities. They have a certain degree of privilege, and these are the people who have been the primary beneficiaries of Me Too. It's interesting to note the kickback against Me Too, which is extremely depressing. Just late last year, Bloomberg wrote a very interesting article, which was conversations and memos that were going around Wall Street. And one particular wealth manager, that's what we're calling them now apparently, was talking about the hiring of women. And there were various memos to the effect that, well, you shouldn't have dinner with a woman, or you shouldn't have a meeting with a woman on her own. But this one particular guy just simply dismissed hiring women as an unknowable risk that could only come back to haunt you. So there is a sense that instead of having a real sort of go at the systemic issues here, we're just getting a circling of the wagons. And we're just getting the same privileged people circling in, embedding in, and using and creating a self-perpetuating prejudice from getting caught out. There's a really, really large problem too with the fact that society wants to believe men. We're all Fox Mulder on this stuff. We want to be able to watch Woody Allen movies in peace. We don't want to sit there and watch Manhattan and feel really, really uncomfortable watching 42-year-old Woody Allen with teenage Mariel Hemingway. We want to be able to laugh at Annie Hall. We want to be able to laugh at Louis C.K. And it's very interesting that the second generation feminists, and particularly people like Germaine Greer, have been very vocal in the issues like the Weinstein case, and to the tune of, well, what the hell did they expect going into his room when he was wearing that towel? There's also been a kind of movement, we've seen it among the French feminists, and women like Catherine Deneuve, fretting publicly in a letter that their days of ass-patting are over, and that is a real issue. Internalized misogyny is a very, very real issue, to say nothing of the old actual rampant regular misogyny. There's a real problem. I have a friend who works in a tabloid newspaper here, and who was telling me a story about it's really awful because my senior editor can't give me compliments anymore on my skirts. And I just thought, oh my God, I don't even know how to unpick this conversation. He also was really embarrassed because there was a new young intern and he wanted to tell her she looked quite shapely, and he decided that might be inappropriate, what with this witch hunt going on. I'm sure everybody here has come across the term witch hunt about 100 million times in the last 18 months. And it's evidence of the really genuine systemic problem that we're up against here. Nobody mentions that in Ireland. No, let's not even think about for a moment harassment in workplace. As Taryn was saying, like convicted rapists in 2016, a third of them had partially suspended sentences. If it's lenient for actual rape, how on earth are we going to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace? How are we going to deal with smaller level intimidation in the workplace? This is why somewhere between 90 and 95% of victims don't come forward. And why would they come forward? There are severe consequences for coming forward, and they outweigh the consequences for sexual harassment and misconduct. If we don't have time to deal with rapists properly, how on earth are we going to deal with people who are repeat sexual harassers? We cling to a society where capital is controlled by a very privileged few and a very few multinationals. And while we cling to that kind of society, we're only reinforcing the inequality that will allow women and people of colour and LGBT individuals to be exploited. A hashtag is not going to protect women working in fast food industry, working in catering, working on delivery bikes. It's not going to protect people, particularly in a society where our rights as workers are constantly being eroded. They're eroded by signing NDAs. They're eroded by wage theft. They're eroded by zero-hour contracts. How are we going to stand up to our bosses who are sexually harassing us in the workplace when all of the rights that are being taken away that can only bolster the boss's position and their class in control? There is a need for a very complex and holistic conversation here, and a very complex and holistic solutions. And a hashtag is not it. If men are servants of a very small class of capitalists, then we as women, as Connolly once said, are the slaves of slaves. That's what we're left with. And I think it is extremely telling that Taryn Burke ended up getting written out of the Me Too story. I think that's as emblematic as anything could possibly be. Thank you.
I'm now going to go with Conor Gallagher.
Hi there. It's nice to be the token man for once. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm not a great public speaker and even less great debater. I have to admit I got a fright when I saw the tuxes here this evening, and an even bigger fright when I saw Taryn's wonderful outfit, but then I saw the rest of you and I calmed down. I'm only joking. So I'm here to speak in support of the motion that the Me Too movement is succeeding. And I listened to Constance and Tara's points there with interest that Me Too is a first world phenomenon, and within that first world it's a privileged phenomenon. I have to say I agree. But even within that narrow confines, it is making progress. And I'm going to approach this from a criminal justice point of view, because that's where my experience lies, and it's quite a narrow point of view, but the strides it's making there are quite remarkable, slow as they may be. I believe the Me Too movement is unarguably making a difference to the way victims of crime are treated by the court system. But I believe that this is a movement that is accelerating a change that was already taking place in relation to the way courts treat vulnerable victims and complainants. Many would say the Irish phase of the Me Too movement began with the much publicised trial in Belfast of 2 Irish and Ulster rugby players for rape, a trial which, as everyone here knows, ended in their acquittal. While that was a huge milestone, I do not believe that it was the beginning of the movement here, at least from a criminal justice point of view. I would argue that the movement here started long before that, before it even had a name. Throughout the last decade, we have seen a succession of incredibly brave women come forward and speak about their experiences of sexism, misogyny and rape. People like Niamh Donald, who in 2015 spoke out about the prosecution and conviction of her ex-boyfriend, Magnus Maher, who raped her while she slept. She waived her anonymity, she came forward, and she told her story. That's a prosecution that ended with Husfeld getting a suspended sentence. And Miss Donald spoke out about that. That sentence was later appealed, and he later got a pretty derisory sentence, but a prison sentence nonetheless. Or other people like Lavinia Kerwick, who was one of the first women to waive her right, first rape victims to waive her right to anonymity after going through the court process. Or people like already referenced tonight, Grace Diaz and the other victims of sexual harassment and bullying in the gay theatre, and before that, even the Waking the Feminist movement. So when the Belfast rape trial came along, I think women and people in general had already had enough. This is not the right forum for debating the evidence in that trial. The 4 men were acquitted, and that's that, whether we like it or not. But what we can discuss is why that case was so important. It's important because the young woman at the centre of that case was treated oftentimes abysmally. Her identity was spread on social media despite having a lifelong entitlement to lifelong anonymity. She was cross-examined for 7 days in the box. Most of that cross-examination was respectful and dignified, but sometimes it absolutely was not. And at one stage, her underwear was passed around the court. These factors, combined with the accused's attitude to the complainant after the incident, which was detailed in those horrible text messages, such as top saggers and referring to spit roasts and that sort of stuff, combined to lead to an outcry across the island of Ireland. Thousands of women and men in Belfast, Dublin, Cork, Galway and elsewhere took to the streets to call for reform in the way the justice systems in both jurisdictions handled victims of sexual assault and rape. And for once, it seems, their calls were listened to. In Northern Ireland, retired Judge John Gillan was commissioned to carry out a wide-ranging report on the issue. Last November, he came back with 220 provisional recommendations on how to improve the system for prosecuting sexual assaults, including ways to make a process a less distressing process for the complainant. Banning the public, including supporters of the accused, from the courtroom, this was something that came up every now and again during the 9-week Belfast rape trial, was one of his proposals, as well as the pre-recording of evidence for vulnerable complainants and other witnesses, so they don't have to go through a live cross-examination. And in the Republic, Minister for Justice Charlie Flanagan also announced a similar review that will be carried out about how we treat victims of rape. There's some key differences between the 2 jurisdictions. For example, in Northern Ireland, obviously they're allowed be named, the accused are allowed to be named throughout the process, but down here they're not. But there's some things they might do better, there's some things we might do better, and there's some things that we definitely do worse. So he commissioned a review by the respected barrister and academic Tom O'Malley. I understand this review is going to be published in the next few weeks, or at least before the end of March. It'll cover many of the same areas as the Gillan review, including how victims of rape can be persuaded to come forward and the guidance which should be given to juries on these rape myths, which are so prevalent, including what clothes a victim is wearing or how much a victim is having to drink, having any bearing on them giving consent to sexual intercourse. I can't say for sure what the report will recommend, but given the laws surrounding rape and sexual assault are in many cases 4 decades old or older, I think we can safely assume that it would recommend serious reform. The fact is, these reports would not have been commissioned if it wasn't for the Me Too movement and the outcry which accompanied the Belfast rape trial. That outcry built on a movement that was already building and had been building for many years, but I believe that the movement needed a name and a hashtag to get it across the line. And these changes have resulted in, or the movement has also resulted in changes being felt in other less obvious ways. For example, last month, for an article, I interviewed 7 Irish barristers and asked them if they believed Me Too was being felt within Irish courtrooms, and the answer was a universal yes. Barristers in rape trials, mainly on the defence side, are now raising the Me Too movement or alluding to it in their closing speeches because they know it's playing on juries' minds. And crucially, it was noticed by several practitioners that some usually older barristers with a reputation for uncompromising cross-examinations of sometimes vulnerable witnesses have started tempering their style, perhaps finally realising that making witnesses cry in the box doesn't go down well with a jury. In these early days, it is impossible to say if Me Too is having an influence on conviction rates for sexual crimes. The anecdotal evidence suggests the effect, if any, is very modest. However, and I think Ivana already alluded to this, there are figures showing a significant rise in the number of sexual offences being reported, 10% last year. Now, without in-depth research, and which we'll hopefully see in the forthcoming Savvy report, second Savvy report, it is impossible to say if this increase is solely because of Me Too or because more women are actually being sexually assaulted. I hope dearly it's the latter, and I think it probably is. I think it's fair to say at the very least that Me Too is playing a role in that rise. As I said at the start, Me Too is building on a process that was already in motion, namely the victims' rights movement. Over the last decade, we've seen the introduction of a variety of new measures to make the justice system far less daunting for victims. These include the training of specialist Gardaí in interview skills for vulnerable witnesses, provisions for certain witnesses to give evidence via video link so they don't have to confront their accused in court, a raft of new measures mandating the authorities to keep victims of crime informed about their cases post-conviction, including if their attacker is up for parole or is due to be released, and stronger laws to protect women at immediate risk of domestic violence from a partner, including laws against coercive control, and as I already alluded to, funding finally for a second Savvy report to tell us how bad the problem actually is. Complainants in rape cases can still be cross-examined on their past sexual history, an often distasteful and distressing experience, but one which can sometimes be justified depending on the circumstances, such as if it goes to the credibility of a witness. In the past, barristers have cross-examined female complainants on their past sexual history in the hope a jury would form a certain impression of their character. Today, in my experience, that doesn't fly. A judge will only allow counsel to cross-examine on past sexual history if the barrister can show a very good reason for it. And complainants are entitled to their own legal representation for that distinct part of the trial, paid for through legal aid, to present their own views on the issues, although unfortunately they don't have representation for the rest of the trial, which is something I imagine Tom O'Malley will address in his forthcoming report. So we've discussed if Me Too is making a difference, and I think it absolutely is. Is that difference a good thing? I think it absolutely is. There has been some missteps, such as the rape trial down in Cork, which was widely misreported by my colleagues in the media. The victims, or the complainants' underwear weren't held up in court, and there was a lot of other things left out in that report, but you had a huge backlash and against that barrister. But this is a rare misstep, I think, in a movement that has been largely positive for victim and complainants' rights throughout the court system. I also would argue that it's not a slippery slope, an argument that I hear proposed a lot. A fiercely independent judiciary in this country have always strongly rejected moves to stack the deck against the complainants because they might help the politician at the ballot box. And we must remember, finally, that these reforms will help all victims. Males account for, going on by imperfect data, about 10% of sexual assaults, and more when we're talking about male children. So in a criminal justice context, these reforms, brought about by Me Too, will lay the groundwork so that all victims of sexual assault, male and female, will have a slightly easier time going forward. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Maher.
As a young woman studying law in this country, it's hard sometimes not to feel like I'm staring down the barrel of a gun. I hope to try a case someday, but I hope that I'm never the subject of one, because I know that if I ever was in that position, that I don't think I would ever even put myself forward for it. And a lot of that is due to the way that I've seen the Me Too conversation being handled. I think Me Too has created a culture where I can talk openly about my experiences to some people who I know will believe me, but it has not created a culture where I can be compensated for them in any meaningful sense unless my abuser is someone powerful that people care about, that people are concerned about contributing to in some way. Unless my abuser is a big Hollywood director, which just isn't likely to happen to someone like me. If my abuser is just another person like me, telling my story just actively puts me in danger. I just want to talk a little bit about that in this speech. I think the problem when talking about Me Too is that I think it does have to be something more than a hashtag, because it has to be about bringing people to actual justice. It can't just be them losing their job and getting a new one. It can't just be some people not really wanting to be their friend anymore. It has to be like them actually being punished for things that they can't get away with. I think the trials are not just privately humiliating, but they're now like a media spectacle too, because there's now a market for these kind of details. There's now a market for these kind of really like distressing and terrible details that I don't really think that I'm entitled to, but I now have to carry. I think that I think that's a really problematic thing. They don't want you to just report anymore under the Me Too movement. You have to be brave, you have to be strong, you have to speak up, but you also have to be a martyr. You have to prove to other women that when you report, you can get somewhere. And I think that's a really difficult burden to put on victims. And I don't think that's really fair. I don't want to be a martyr, but even if I did want to, the Me Too movement doesn't want someone like me as a martyr. They want someone famous. They want someone at the top so that people can look up to them and say that if they can do it, then maybe I can too. So I kind of want to talk in light of that about how I think revolutions, if they're going to be really successful, have to be bottom up and not top down, and how it's more meaningful to more vulnerable people when they are bottom up and not top down. So I don't think that watching successful people at the top helps me at the bottom for a number of reasons. Because watching the perfect victims fail is just so disheartening to someone who, to an average person, to someone who has been a victim of things like, I don't even want to use the word harassment. I feel like the word harassment is for people who are more powerful than me, for people who are more likely to be believed, people with thousands of Twitter followers who are going to rally behind them and believe them when they say that. I think watching those perfect victims fail is terrible, because if Christine Blasey Ford, who's a doctor and a really respectable person in all sort of spheres of life, someone that men who usually wouldn't respect women, who wouldn't respect young party girls or young students or people like me, are willing to give respect to, but if she can't, the point at which a perfect victim can get nothing, I don't really think that I can either. Watching that trial was genuinely, as a woman, one of the most difficult things that I did last year. Watching this really formidable woman, this beacon of strength, who was explaining whenever there was gaps in her memory, she was able to point to the psychology as to why there was gaps in her memory, because she was traumatized and her memory was kind of fragmented because of that. To the point where her voice is cracking in the courtroom and she's asking, can she have a can of Coke because she needs something sugary to give her the energy to just keep telling this story that's so horrific to her. At the point at which she fails, I don't really think there's much hope for someone like me who doesn't have those credentials, who doesn't automatically have that jury respect. I think when I look at Belfast, I just still can't believe how brave that girl was to report in the first place, because I know that I wouldn't. I know that if a powerful person did that to me when I'm in a position of such imbalance, when there's no millions of Twitter followers coming to rally behind me, I know that I just wouldn't do that. I also just think that I didn't need all the detail that I got about the Belfast rape case. I didn't need the daily updates that I was getting all over Twitter. I didn't need to see so many people who I considered my friends, weighing in on this girl's grief, who we don't know and who we don't deserve to talk about like that. To talk about the worst moments of her life as if it's just small talk conversation about, did you see the latest article? I don't really think that that's fair. Seeing those texts, seeing what those men at the top, men who men around me respect, men who people are fans of, knowing that men at the top can speak about me that way and get away with it doesn't help me at the bottom, because I know, I know firsthand, from this whole group chat problem in schools where guys would send around nudes from their girlfriends to their friends, and who would then send that into further group chats and stuff like that, knowing that those guys aren't going to get anything done about it, but maybe if they were more powerful, or if maybe somebody took a challenge against them, they would. It doesn't really give me a whole lot of hope, because I think it's good that we're all collectively carrying this anger, but there's only so much anger that we can take before our backs start to break, and I think that that's really important to consider. I don't think that I would report. I think after reading the Belfast trial, I literally cried for a full hour, and I decided that I would be happy to fight for other people, but I don't think I would ever fight for myself in that context. And I think that's a really important impact of Me Too, and I think that it's something that's we really need to sort of think about those kind of ugly truths. Yeah, I think that's really important. I just don't think that I would remember. I know so many other women who've been in that situation who said following it that they kind of felt the same way, that they kind of felt failed by it. If this was coming from the bottom up rather than wealthy Hollywood actresses, I think things would be different. I'm delighted that Uma Thurman and all of these people are getting justice against these terrible things that happen to them, and I can only imagine the sort of strength and moral fortitude it takes to be able to come forward with information like that. But the thing is that they have all this money and they have all this power and they're already so loved by so many people that it's a lot easier for them to do than it is for me. And I think like a red carpet protest is a very nice idea, but it's just not something that's available to so many women. So like at the point where like even like me working waitressing, when men hit on me, that I have to just smile and take it. When I get tipped a condom, I have to just smile and take it. When like only last week, like a man who I thought was my friend was like, it was just making me so uncomfortable. And again, I don't even want to use the word harassment, but I know that's what it was. And I won't say anything to him about it because I don't want him to make Me Too jokes about me. I don't want him to ask what even is acceptable anymore. I don't even want him to be like, I thought we were friends, I thought this was fine. I think that Me Too fuels this kind of backlash. It fuels it for women at the top, and it fuels it so much more for women in the bottom, because at least the women in the top have something behind them, a leg that they can stand on. When you don't have that, when you don't have any of those protections that the movement claims to have for you, it's really, really difficult. I want to tell him that Me Too shouldn't scare you if you're not a prick, but I'm too scared to. And maybe I'm a weak woman or a weak feminist, but maybe this is just a brand of feminist empowerment that was never created with me in mind. Maybe this is just something that wasn't for me and that was never going to be me. I just think that's really harmful. I think, like, at the point where we're looking at, like, the R. Kelly getting a documentary but not getting put in prison, I think that it's harmful. I think when we look at Ronaldo and how everybody's asking how this victim is taking a settlement, it's like, I'd take a settlement too, so that I wouldn't have to go through that horror and that pain, but people want her to be a martyr, which is just putting so much more pressure on a woman who's already had probably the worst experience of her life to do more. We're getting more women bashing from people who are meant to be on their side by saying, you can report, you can report, you can report, we're going to get him, we're going to get him, when everywhere around them is suggesting that that's just not going to happen at all. I just think that when revolutions start at the top, it reduces the hope of those at the bottom. We look to the top for hope because we can't see any around us in our daily life, and we don't see it even there. I don't think we really see it anywhere. I don't think this culture of like being able to talk about your experiences is as important as being able to have those experiences compensated and rectified in a real and meaningful way, which is what these people deserve. Thank you for listening.
How can we say that a movement is succeeding if it's failing some of the most vulnerable people that it's supposed to be supporting? So 3 main points in the speech. First of all, I'll be talking about some of the problems with the very premise of Me Too and the way and essentially how this movement is built around expecting victims to come forward and share their experiences. Then my second point will be about how it's mostly like a conversation taking place online. It is more than the hashtag, but really a little more, and why really like a conversation isn't worth much if it isn't backed up by real, tangible action. And thirdly, I'll be talking about some of the voices that haven't been heard very much in this conversation, and why for movements like these it's very important that that these voices that often aren't listened to are like very much built into the conversation, not simply forgotten about or pushed to the side or saying, we'll come back to that later. So, first of all, Me Too is all about expecting victims to come forward, to share their experiences. You know, it's a place where people come together and get support, and that is great for the people who feel comfortable doing that. Many people do not. First of all, as I'm sure most people here know, particularly women, these problems are so very pervasive, and you know, we've heard about how, you know, this is highlighting just how pervasive it is. You know, like we now know how widespread a problem it is. I'm pretty sure most people, certainly women, already knew just how pervasive this problem really was. What's really happening is that we're talking about it to men more, I suppose. We've heard about, you know, so many people have now spoken to their male friends who now, you know, have a better understanding of what the problem this is. However, like, how is it fair to expect people to share their most personal stories, like some of the most vulnerable things that have ever happened to them, just so that their male friends will like listen to them and believe their experiences? You know, like why is it necessary for people to share some of their most personal stories just so that people understand just how big of an issue this is, just how widespread of a problem it already is? Also, so often when women talk about their experiences, especially to their friends, we don't call it sexual harassment or assault or rape. It's just so normalized that it's just part of everyday conversation. We don't even think about it like that. You know, it's that guy is really creepy. You know, make sure you watch your drink. Text your friends every minute of the night, especially if you're out of sight. We don't even think about it in that context. So I'm sure like there are so many people like who wouldn't even feel comfortable like, you know, associating themselves with Me Too, like tweeting about it saying like, this is my story as a victim, because so many people don't think of themselves as victims because it's such a pervasive problem that it's just normal. We don't even see it as abuse or harassment most of the time. So And often, like, people obviously then aren't going to get that support and that sense of community from sharing their stories if they don't even see like this as applying to them. And as we've already heard in the opposition, also so often, the stories that are shared are the ones that are, from the right victims, where it's very clear-cut, where it's very obvious that something bad has happened, that someone crossed the line. However, in real life, there's usually a lot more grey areas than it is black and white. It's simply not that clear-cut. And when we're only hearing the stories of when it's the most obvious, of the most extreme cases, then it can actually make it harder for people with more normalised, everyday stories that, more people can relate to actually come forward and share their experiences. Also, this whole thing, it puts pressure on people to come forward, but really the emphasis is on victims, and it's not about the people who are actually harassing or abusing them. What Me Too really hasn't done is actually educate us more about what sexual harassment and abuse can look like. We've been talking to victims, saying you can come forward and share your stories, but not to the people who've been doing these things to them, to encourage people to examine their own behaviour. And so often the people see themselves in these stories being shared. What people should really be looking for is seeing if they see themselves in the stories of the people who have actually done these things. Have they ever made someone feel uncomfortable like this? Because really that's where the problem lies. It's simply too late addressing the problem after it's already happened. We should actually be addressing the root of it. We should really be directing our messages more at the people who are perpetuating this culture and this behaviour, rather than simply, encouraging victims to come forward and share their experiences. That's simply not enough. We actually have to talk to the people who are actually who are making people uncomfortable, who are being inappropriate, whether it's in the workplace or in so many other areas of life. So really the whole premise of, I suppose, making victims feel that it's all on them, that they to come forward and share their stories, it's just completely going about it the wrong way. Next point is about how this conversation is mostly taking place online. We've heard some examples of how it's impacted rape trials or workplace laws. Really, most of it has simply been dialogue, which isn't backed up much by action. These conversations are often taking place online, not so much in real life, particularly people from rural areas, for example. I know for me, it's great, I actually hear these conversations happening a lot because, I'm in Dublin, I'm in Trinity College. When I go home for the weekend, back to the west of Ireland, trust me, I don't hear these same conversations happening. It wasn't out in the open, there wasn't this dialogue while I was in school. And certainly, there, were no resources, even, in real life, people need actual physical supports to go to. But what about support groups? I certainly didn't know of any when I was in school. There was no public transport. If, people wanted to go to a support group, how would they even get there? Are they supposed to expect their family to bring them to one, for example? What if their family aren't supportive? And these are the kind of things that we should be talking about, what actual supports are there for people? Because, simply talking about it online isn't enough. What about when you turn off your phone, when, you disconnect from the internet? What is there for you then? We do need more than just a conversation. We've been having so many conversations, but there's been so little action to back it up. And another problem with all this conversation is it's just a constant reminder to people, to women in particular, of just how big of a problem this is. And it's already exhausting having to live with it all the time, without having to constantly hear about it as well. In the media, every time you go online, there's simply more and more stories, and just a constant reminder of how big of a problem this is, but without anything to actually address it. And then, also, we've heard a lot about, women who are minorities, women who are working class, women with disabilities, how it affects them. But these are more than simply groups of people. For example, women with disabilities. How many people here have really thought about when you have a disability, you're so often financially dependent on people around you and dependent in other ways. People, particularly in homes or with carers or in special classes in schools, are put in very vulnerable positions. And, and that is something that Me Too hasn't addressed. And, and it should be, because if Me Too doesn't address it, then who is going to address it? And yeah, these are simply groups of women that we list at the end of the conversations about, oh yeah, it can be harder for women with disabilities, for example, without actually really thinking about it. But, so often, the voices that, we don't take the time to listen to are the most important in conversations like this. And instead of expecting people to speak up, particularly if the people who often already don't feel like they have a voice in this conversation, we need to actually make a place for it, rather than simply expecting people who've already been through so much to do all the work themselves. So yes, just because good things come out of a movement, it doesn't mean that it's succeeding. Because when it's failing, some of the most vulnerable people involved in it, and it certainly is not a success. Thank you.
motion to the House. On the motion, this House believes that Me Too is succeeding. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
All those against say nay. Nay. I think the ayes have it. Well, I think that was for a lot of people, and certainly for me, an amazing evening, listening to people, not just being debaters, but I think in many ways talking about some of their own personal life experience, feelings that are still very raw and personal, and with them, whenever something happens, to remind them of something that may have been a betrayal, an assault, a difficulty. I mean, I think we heard the whole gamut, and I have to say, listening here, I kept, if you like, being on the side of the ayes and the Me Too movement is succeeding, but I would say not enough. And in fact, I think the people who spoke on the other side told us a lot about what should be there as well, and also the limitation of essentially a social media conversation that to some degree, helpfully maybe anonymous, but in other ways ought also, for the sake of everybody's sanity, empathy, understanding, ought to be a personal conversation as well. And I noted in particular that the people on the nay side, on the opposing side, talked a lot about talking to personal friends through things that had happened to them, and that cathartic feeling of having people that you can talk to about something, but also the benefit of Me Too, that here was something out there, that's something you hadn't maybe been able to talk to people about or address properly, you now could do. So I think in that sense, it was a really, really good, very, very thoughtful debate. And I think the interesting thing as well, for me as somebody who, like Ivana, was once a senior lecturer in the DIT, nobody was moving in the audience, nobody was chatting to anybody else, everyone was listening. So well done on that to all the speakers. I want to say something, by the way, to cheer you all up, because, you know, politics is something that moves, social conventions are things that move, and it's for everybody to do their job, to change it in a way that's positive and, I suppose, just makes for more freedom and a better world and all those things that all politicians aspire to, but have a lot of difficulty in delivering. I was in the United States last week for two reasons. One was it's a new Congress there, and the State of the Union speech was on, and the new members of Congress were taking their seats. Now, there's a funny thing between the States and Ireland. In 2020, it'll be 100 years of women getting to vote in the United States. And of course, in December 1918 was the first time women got to vote. Women over 30 who either had some property or lived in a family who had property got the vote. And the funny thing is, notwithstanding all the fantastic developments and successes of both societies, the number of women involved in politics and in positions of public power, and indeed in corporate power, is actually very, very small in both countries. However, when I was in the halls of Congress, it was full of women dressed in white. The women who had just succeeded for the Democratic Party in being elected to the Congress. And they came from every part of the United States and from every ethnic background and every walk of life that you could possibly imagine. And, you know, at the State of the Union speech, I wasn't there for that part, I watched it on television, as the president swaggered and, you know, made all those gestures that he's I suppose, so appalling in many ways for. But they were there, sitting together on block. I'm sure a lot of people must have seen this. And essentially, they were a really strong statement that here we are and we're going to make this different. And in a way, if they are part, if you like, of what the Me Too movement has bred, a consciousness among women that somebody who's been so gross and grotesque about women and so enabling of people who would be abusive, I think, of either men or women, that it had produced this counter-reaction, and these women were sitting there and they weren't just taking it, and they were intending to change it. And I think that that was really important. The other part of the debate that fascinated me was the commentary from Ivana and from Conor about the courts. But also what Taryn said about why she felt so reluctant about being a witness or encouraging other people to be a witness. And I had an experience myself not too long ago in the court where for a number of days there were 7 senior counsel lined up, backed up by 7 junior counsel, backed up by 7 senior solicitors. So there were 21 people there. One was a woman, by the way. And there was just a very strong feeling that as I was a witness, that they were going to do their best for their clients to get me. And I remember thinking to myself and talking to a friend, like people said they'd, talked about their experiences, and saying, I've always been an enormous supporter, personally, of the rape crisis centres, and was the chair of one that was formed in Blanchardstown in my own constituency, and we got built. And so I've always encouraged people to go forward and to give evidence. But after my own experience, I remember saying to people, would I really? Because I was just talking about politics and political views and my personal life, but not my private sexual life. But I still found it horrendous. And the woman who was with me and who was also a witness, who was working with me, she found it absolutely dreadful as well. So I do think that the courts probably have a long way to go in terms of how people experience these things. I'm also conscious of the fact that as a legislator, I've been involved in bringing a couple of bills successfully through the Dáil as minister. Way back, the first Refugee Act, and as Ivana said earlier, she and I have a long connection. I met Ivana when I was in my 30s, and Ivana was about 17 or 18. But I think we clicked then, and we've always we've always kept the connection. And because at a certain stage in my career, I worked in Africa, I worked in Rwanda after the genocide, where rape, as is so much the case in Africa and in lots of conflict zones in the world, and in Europe, in Bosnia, when the Bosnian War was on, rape and sexual assault is a weapon of war. And it's generally against women, but it doesn't only have to be against women. It can be against men, and it can be against young people of either sex. It doesn't particularly discriminate. And so when it came to the Refugee Act and its development and getting it passed into Dáil in 1996, there wasn't that much discussion about it in great detail. Now, a subsequent government came in and, of course, took lots of it apart pretty much immediately. But certainly when you think of people looking for asylum in Ireland who have maybe experienced and often genuinely are coming from conflict zones, where rape, sexual violence, and general violence is a feature of what their experience has been. Again, I think that is something that in the Western world, maybe ultimately the Me Too movement will help us to think about. And also to think about the storytelling that somebody who is looking for protection, coming from the Geneva Convention, which is to tell the story of what happened to them. But sometimes telling a story is really, really hard. It sounds easy because tell the truth and you'll be fine. But, you know, remember when you were a small kid and, I don't know, maybe a teacher or somebody pulled you up and just said, tell the truth, and you're so conflicted about what is the truth that you want to tell. So it certainly strikes me that in terms of Ireland, we've changed as a country, and in a way, Me Too has had, I think, a reception in this country that is a reflection of the change in the country. It's important, I think, that tonight's discussion should empower people. I mean, the old saying of tell a friend. You know, I think the people who spoke for the opposition really made an incredibly eloquent case for the value of doing that. And I would also say as well, going back to the States, and again talking about the balance between men and women, we're coming into St. Patrick's celebrations, and it's now St. Patrick's Month in the States. And of course there's a very big organisation called the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, which doesn't have any women. If somebody like me, if I was going in an official capacity, where I'd go, and by and large I've always refused invitations like that, I'd be made an honorary son for the afternoon or the evening. But in fact the Irish Embassy has now come up with a St. Bridget's Day, week, month celebration. And that was the other reason that I was in the States. And in my case it was rather funny because my birthday is on St. Bridget's Day, although I'm not called British. But what was amazing about St. Bridget's Day was there were a number of events that myself and Frances Fitzgerald spoke at, and they were really packed out with an enormous intensity again about the situation of women in Ireland, huge amount of amazement about the repeal campaign and what it meant in terms of empowering women and recognising women and recognising the issues and finally having this conversation. So what I would say is congratulations to whoever thought up the topic for tonight, because I think in a certain sense it's an unusual topic in the sense that in the debates that I've been used to, they certainly have not been as quiet as this debate. So I think there's been lots of food for thought here tonight. And just on your behalf and my own behalf, I want to thank all the contributors and all of the speakers and all of the people who've been so brave. And Taryn talked in some detail to us about her own experiences. And that's always difficult to do. Just because people can be polished performers, it doesn't mean that it's any easier. But I think in maybe talking to us, Tara as well, I could feel the emotion in her voice. And, you know, one phrase stood out, the casting couch, having been kind of known and heard about that for generations, and yet it's only really come up for discussion now. So thank you to everybody. And all I can say is I do hope that women continue to be empowered and to grow in power in this country, supported by the men who like them, respect them, love them, live with them, dislike them as well maybe at times. But, you know, we're getting there, and Ireland is a better place, I think, for debates like this tonight. Thank you all.
just to read it. I'm totally staying.